It has been said that you don't build character by talking about it, you build character by demanding it. That's the voice and vision of Brett Ledbetter, a leader who has spent his entire career challenging coaches and athletes to stop settling for slogans and start building substance. Today, I'm excited to have Brett on the Playing with a Purpose podcast to talk about what it means to develop character in sports and what truly drives winning. Welcome to the Playing with a Purpose podcast, where we explore topics related to the moral development of collegiate athletes and young people as it relates to character, responsibility, and purpose. I'm your host, Matt Barker, and I'm joined today by someone who's a nationally respected voice in character development, leadership, and transformational coaching. He's dedicated his career to answering one of the most important questions in sports: what truly drives winning? I'm excited to welcome Mr. Brett Ledbetter to the podcast. Brett, welcome.
Great to be with you.
If you would just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, some background information, where you grew up, where you went to college, and what led you to where you are today.
Grew up in a small town outside of St. Louis, Missouri. I played college basketball at a junior college. Then I went to the University of Idaho, and then I finished back up at a D2 close to home. While I transferred back to the D2, I started a basketball academy. Did that for about 10 years, crossed paths with my co-founder of What Drives Winning, Becky Burley. And we started a collaboration at the University of Florida. And so the last, I would say, 13 years or so, we've been working in the college and pro space on athlete and coach development.
Found out a little bit more about you from Mr. Drew Stutz, who is the head coach of the men's basketball program here. About season 1, we did the podcast, and after we got done, he said, "Hey, I know a guy that I've been reading his book, What Drives Winning, and a lot of what you talk about on your podcast, he would be a great one to have on." So he's the one who kind of let me know a little bit about you. And then I started reading some of your books and following your podcast. So it's really great to have you on today. Excited about the conversation today. If you want to follow Brett on his social media, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, at What Drives Winning. There's a lot of great content there. He also has a podcast, the What Drives Winning Conversations, where he talks a lot with pro coaches, athletes, collegiate athletes. A lot of great content. I really enjoy the content that you put out there. Really excited to have you on today. Let's just start out here with, you've spent a lot of years analyzing coaches and interviewing them and doing all these different things to try to figure out what else is involved with winning besides just talent. So what first convinced you that character, not necessarily just talent, is the ultimate separator?
Our journey started with character development, and the person that put that on my radar was Dr. Jim Loehr. And I was introduced to his book called The Only Way to Win. And when I read that, that was the first time that I had ever been exposed to anything like that. And it was given to me by a friend, and then that friend connected me to Jim. And at that point in time, we were running this basketball academy, and all of the kids were coming in, and we would start at the beginning of the session. We would do a 30-minute film room, and we would just go and interview coaches and show them to the kids and then ask them questions. One of the people that we did that with was Dr. Jim Loehr. And when I interviewed him, it was such a transformative experience for me because I had never been exposed to that level of framework. And then we started to take that into our basketball academy, and it became a foundational piece for us. And when you start to focus on who the person is becoming as a result of the chase, as opposed to the rewards you get from the chase, it becomes a multidimensional experience. And if you do that, what I've found is you're more likely to actually get the results by focusing on a person-first approach.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of times I talked to the baseball coach here at Freed Hardeman, and early on in his career, he mentioned exactly that. He said he was focusing on how he could get wins, and he would tailor his practices and everything about how can we get more wins. And later on in his career, he focused on more developing the person. And he said, as a result, the wins came, but it wasn't because necessarily the same approach that he used early on in his coaching career. So thinking about maybe that different mindset that coaches have to have, what would you say probably from working with different coaches and athletes is probably the biggest misconception that coaches have about how to maybe go about building character and not just focusing on the wins?
One of the most powerful exercises we do with teams is we just ask them, and everyone writes their answers down, is what are the top 3 things that can get in the way of this team maximizing its ability? And whenever everyone ever does that, we then call out all the answers and we write them up on a board. We then give them sticky notes where they write those answers down, and we divide the board into 2 categories: human-related issues sport-related issues. And that's just the technical, tactical aspects of the sport. And we asked them to put the sticky notes on which category their answers fall under. And it's amazing. Every time we do that, north of 90% of those challenges fall to the human-related issues. And what you're trying to do is create an awareness that the things that actually get in the way of this team are within our control, and that's what we should be focused on. And when you get a buy-in and get actionable items around that, they start to take pride in that, and then all the other stuff is driven by the human.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I looked up too, a lot of coaches might think, well, just by playing sports itself, it builds that character. But I think there is more from the information I've gathered from talking to different coaches and different things. Character can be gained through sports, but it takes an intentional effort, right? We don't have just by playing a sport, we're going to automatically get a lot of those character qualities because competitiveness gets in the way and all those different things. So not just playing the sport really makes the difference. It's really the coaches making an intentional effort in building that.
I think language creates consistency. And so if we all agree that these are our values that we're going to pursue, we need to define what those values look like in action in a simple way that we all can agree on. And then once we do that, then we can measure ourselves against those values. If we don't, everyone might interpret the word positive in a much different way. But when you use the definition, we close the gap of interpretation, we create clarity, which then allows us to add an added layer of checks and balances, and then it can be something that we actually embody as a team.
Yeah. And I think maybe this is something you've mentioned. I've listened to your podcast quite a bit, so you might remember this, but you mentioned defining things clearly. And one of the things I remember is define character clearly, and character must move from abstract values to observable behaviors, right? So it's not just this talk, you're walking the walk and it actually living those things out. So if a coach maybe that's listening to this podcast right now at any level, NCAA, NAIA level, what is one thing they should start doing right away? You mentioned maybe writing some things on the wall and trying to clearly define those things. Is there anything else maybe within that they should start doing right away to try to shift their focus?
I would say that whatever your values are as a program, that's going to be the identity of your team. And when you get really clear on what that is, and let's say it's 5 different characteristics, you can then draw a line by defining what it looks like and what it doesn't look like. And once you have that, you now have the definition. Then the magic becomes on how do we manage that as a group? So anytime we fall short of that, how do we correct the future behavior? And then when we actually embody it, how do we appreciate and recognize it so it's repeated? And then beyond that, from a leadership perspective, probably the most important thing you do is you are the standard. You're the physical manifestation of whatever you're asking them to do. And so when you define something, if you do not embody that and you don't recognize that you had a weak moment, that creates a double standard. And the goal is to live above the line and be whatever you say you are, because that builds trust.
Yeah. Every team's going to be different, right? Every culture of a team, that's the unique aspect of sports. Every team has a unique culture. So there might not be one specific answer to this question. Is there anything that maybe all teams that have championship level characters demonstrate, maybe some habits that they embody as a team as a whole? Is there any daily habits that maybe come to your mind that build that character?
I would say that every team is different. Every athlete is different. And so I would start by answering it that way. And to go back to the previous answer, I would say that the most important thing you do as a leader is how you define, manage, and model your vision as a leader. And when you do that, that allows you to create consistency around the identity of your team. And when you have a strong identity, you don't drift as much during adversity. So if things hit, some teams separate, some come together. When you have a very strong idea, an identity, and a connection, that's oftentimes when teams come together.
Yeah. One of the things that you hear often spoken about this is you mentioned this with your coaches embodying and modeling the behavior they want their athletes to do. So I think a big part of that is accountability, right? If the coach messes up and maybe doesn't do things the right way, taking ownership of that. And I think that helps the athletes to know, hey, he's not just telling us to do this. He's willing to, if he makes a mistake, willing to admit that as well. So I think what I hear you saying is accountability probably is a big part of that, is owning your mistakes, owning the things you do well, but also owning those things that you maybe mess up on as well. And that helps the athletes know they can maybe admit when they're wrong and not try to be selfish in that way too. So you actually did a TED Talk on this back in 2018. So I've watched this and it kind of made me think of this question: how athletes can separate identity from just their performance. I think that's where you get into more of the character, where it's not just on how can I win this game, but how can I develop as a player. And one of the things you mentioned there was normalizing imperfect performance, right? Not trying to be perfect in everything you do, but really separating that uniform from the person and actually developing that, and not just the skill, but also developing the character. So how can coaches, how can those working with athletes separate identity from performance, just the wins and losses?
One of the coolest exercises you can do with an athlete that struggles with perfectionism is have them write a letter to perfectionism, because you're now personalizing that topic, and then you can start to understand the relationship that they have, when it's productive, when it's unproductive. And when they get clarity, that clarity creates a perception that then changes the future behavior. The same can be true about identity. Whenever you are over-identified with your results, and the reason that happens is if you think about young athletes, what are the top 2 questions a basketball player gets asked after a game by someone that wasn't at the game? Did you win? How many points did you score? And when they give good answers, what happens? They get applause,
right.
They get approval, and that feels good. And then they want more of that feeling, so they chase that feeling. And depending on how addicted they become to that feeling, that unlocks a ton of energy. And if that energy is directed at development, they can become really good. The challenge is the higher you go, you start to build everything around that. So when you get criticism, the criticism affects you the same level that that praise affected you. And at that point, you have to take a step back and look at your situation and say, all right, what actually matters here? And when you get to that place, that's when you can start to discern, okay, I am not a human doing. I am a human being.
Right.
And I need to focus on who I'm becoming. And when I do that, that's going to help this, and it's going to be a more stable foundation. And I don't have to ride the emotional roller coaster of the highs and lows, because my value is not tied to that. My value is tied to my response to what I'm going through.
Yeah. It kind of leads us into the next question I had, because with the way the landscape of college sports has changed within just the past 10 years, we have transfer portal, we have NIL, and you mentioned, specifically athletes focusing on, they like that attention. They like people telling them they did a good job. They like scoring the most points. So when they're asked, they can talk about those achievements, and they don't always focus maybe on the development of other things. How has the transfer portal and NIL impacted character development, maybe more than even just 10 years ago?
Basketball was started with peach baskets. It's evolved to what it is today.
Yeah.
Evolution is happening every year. Innovation, progression, that is never changing. So if we understand that the innovation is a predictable event, then adaptability becomes so important. So in today's era, the circumstances have changed. However, the approach doesn't have to. You just leverage whatever the competitive experience, the lessons that it's teaching you, to help people understand. So yes, are things starting to get commercialized at younger and younger levels? Absolutely. What is the opportunity in that? And for everyone, you're going to say different things. If character development is what you value, there's great opportunity in understanding how to connect what's happening over here with who they are becoming as a result of the chase. And I think coaches that resist change are slow to adapt, and that makes their teams slow to adapt. If you have a coach that's quick to adapt, that embraces innovation, what's next? How do we be first? Then you have a team that follows suit, and there's comfortability with adaptability. And that is really important when you're going to the end and trying to compete at the highest level.
Yeah. Have you seen any particular programs that stand out to you where they have embraced this a little bit, maybe more than others that maybe take more of a traditional standpoint on it and have really embraced the NIL transfer portal and thrived in it?
I think the coaches that take a look back and say, okay, what is our competitive advantage with whatever constraints we have, are the ones that oftentimes advance, because they're not looking at these issues as threats. They're looking at them as opportunities. And if you can view things as an opportunity and have an appreciation that you have a competitive advantage just by looking at it as an opportunity, that energy is going to flow back to your team, and your team will feel that from you. And then trust will be built to where then you can be a more resilient team because of that.
Yeah. We have a lot of parents that listen to this podcast as well, and thinking about athletes that might go on to play NCAA collegiate sports, maybe NAIA level, whatever the case is. What can parents do at home to maybe help encourage their children or their athletes that they have in their home to maybe develop some of these skills that make it maybe a little easier on the coaches when they get to that level?
Best parenting exercise that we do is we ask them two questions. First question is, what do you want your child to get out of the sport experience? We actually have them write that down. Then the second question we ask is, what role do you think you should play as a parent? And they write that down. And that's a social contract, because as a leader, if you understand the why, and then you understand their role. And once you have that, then you can figure out how to interface with that. I think one of the most powerful exercises we ever did with a group of youth parents is, as people were transitioning out of our basketball academy, most of them at that point were done with the sport in a competitive sense. Maybe they would go on to do intramurals, whatever. We would ask the parents to write a letter to themselves day one when they dropped their child off at their first practice. And it was amazing what would come out of those letters. And had they have parented with that perspective, I think they would have seen a lot more opportunity to do some of the other things. The cool thing that we would do is we would take that information, distill it down, and then give it to people who were just starting their journey, just to create an awareness of, hey, this is someone that's traveled the path, someone that you respected, all different levels, all different results. And here's what they're saying. How do you interact with that? And then that helps them advance the conversation in their own hands so that they can be the person that they want to be.
That's great advice. All right. We have a rapid fire questions, and some of these might not be a short answer, but I'm going to go through these and you tell me the first thing that comes to your mind as far as these rapid fire questions. Are you ready? All right. Talent or toughness?
Talent is the price of admission at the highest level. If you don't have the intangibles, it's going to be very difficult to sustain, because that's what separates people when talent is equal.
Process or results?
The best coaches that I've been around have an extraordinarily ability to focus on what drives the result, and that's the process. And you can just observe coaches. Here's a great exercise as coaches can do is, first of all, ask yourself, what are the signals of a process-driven coach? And then go observe someone and then write down all of the mixed signals that you see. And that gives you clarity, because again, as your perception changes, behavior follows. Everyone says, outcome over process. The challenge is when you're forced with, hey, if I just prioritize the short term here, it might have a long-term cost, but we get what we want right now. Those are the nuances that make really great coaches from championship coaches.
Yeah. Control or trust?
One of the things we talked about in what drives winning was anytime that you have to rely on power, that disrupts the relationship. And so when you're trying to convert losing habits, there's two ways you can do it: by trying to force compliance or by winning influence. What we've learned is that anytime someone wants to change, there's a 400% acceleration rate as to someone that has to change. And so for us, our goal is always to win influence by meeting people where they are to help them coach themselves through a difficult time.
Intensity or consistency?
If you think about the best coaches that you've been around and think about the people that you've had in your past, you don't have to talk to them to understand the advice that they would give you. That's how their spirit lives on through you. And there's such beauty in that. The stronger your consistency is, the more that's going to live on through your spirit with all the people that you're leading.
Confidence or humility?
One of my favorite exercises to train humility is to think of a really great achievement and then list out all the reasons what had nothing to do with you on why it happened. And if you really take a step back and look at that soberly, you're like, wow, there are so many different contributing factors. Why am I over-involving myself with this outcome? And then on the flip side, if things go bad, you can do the same things on the way that you contributed to that. And I've found that leaders that are able to counterbalance the outcomes, to truly understand what's happening, it puts them in a more neutral place to give clear feedback, to water both seats, confidence and humility with their team.
That's really good advice. And that's something that a lot of athletes today could probably benefit from is when there's something good that happens, look back and think about all the people that helped you get there. And that really makes you quite a bit more humble, I would say. So good advice there. Now, this next one, there might not be one particular one that comes to mind, but from your experience with coaches and those that are in leadership positions, any position of authority, what would you say is the best leadership trait?
One thing I really respect from coaches is when they become the student. And their whole goal is to learn and get a PhD in each individual and the team to understand why they're doing what they're doing. One thing that's happening when that happens is they're showing their team what it looks like to learn. So they're modeling what they're asking from them. They're also asking a lot of questions. They're active listening. They're trying to meet people where they are on their journey so they can walk with them. And when you do that, people feel sincerity. And when they feel sincerity, they're more likely to drop their guards and open up. One of my favorite things at the professional level that a coach said is there's a great metric of the relationship. How honest of a conversation can you have? And I found that the best way to get to honest conversations is not by talking. It's by asking and listening.
Yeah, that's a good rule. Brett, I really appreciate you taking the time today. I know you're a busy guy. Is there anything else that maybe we didn't get to that you'd like to add? Any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
I've really appreciated our time together, and best of luck to you and all your work.
I want to leave everyone with a quote today as we conclude the episode. Talent wins games, but character wins championships, and the lessons you learn off the field last longer than any season. Thanks for joining me on today's episode of the Playing with a Purpose podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like and follow the podcast to be notified of upcoming release dates and content. You can listen to the Playing with a Purpose podcast each week on Spotify or anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can also catch the Playing with a Purpose podcast on the NAIA Champions of Character website at naia.org/champions of character and on the Ministry League podcast network. Until next time, remember, winning isn't about the scoreboard, it's about the character you build along the way. We'll see you next time on the Playing with a Purpose podcast.